Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations, and Happy New Year! I'm recording this episode on the first day of 2025. It's been a long time since I last posted an episode. It was on the 2nd of November, so almost 2 months ago. I had a little hiatus because I wanted to focus on my PhD application. So as listeners may know, I've been doing an MA for the past few years, part-time, alongside being a teacher. And I've spent a lot of time studying the role of extrinsic rewards in character development. I find it very interesting and very rewarding work, and I'd like to continue that work at PhD level. In particular, I want to look at whether reflection can help facilitate the shift from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation, or from external forms of motivation to more autonomous forms of motivation. So I spent a few months there since November putting my research proposal together and submitting it for a funding application. I'm hoping to get some funding to do my PhD, so we'll see what happens there. So that's the reason why I've been away for a few months. I hope you'll forgive me, but I'm back now and I intend to resume posting an episode every couple of weeks or so in the new year. Now, I've got a few things I'd like to discuss today, and I think that the thread that binds the three things together is behaviour management. They all relate to behaviour management in one way or another. First, I'll talk about an experience that I've had recently. So, a few weeks ago, for the first time ever, I kept my whole class, most of them anyway. This was my year 10 class. I kept all of them, nearly all of them, behind at break time. I've never done that before. Normally, I try to ensure that sanctions are targeted and specific. So if I find myself needing to use sanctions, I usually like it to be at the individual rather than at the collective level. Because I do think it's problematic, for various reasons, to punish a whole class. But on this occasion, it was a review lesson, an assessment review lesson. They're always a little bit tricky. Students get a little bit fidgety, a little bit distracted, especially if they're listening to you go through a question at the board, which they got fully correct. So they can be challenging lessons. I do find them the most challenging, I think, in general when it comes to managing behaviour. But anyway, behaviour had been poor. In between each question, conversations would often break out, and it resulted in a lot of lost time. And indeed, it was most of the class. And so I kept the vast majority of them behind at the end of the lesson for 10 minutes at break time. I made them sit in silence and read their reading books throughout break. There were 3 or 4 students who I did let go because I knew for a fact that they hadn't been contributing to the noise in between each question during the lesson. Although that was problematic because then there were some other students who believed adamantly that they hadn't been contributing to the noise either, but I wasn't so sure, who I did keep behind along with the rest of the students for this detention. So they complained bitterly. They weren't very happy with me about that. And indeed, that is one of the problems with keeping big groups of students behind for a collective punishment. Indeed, some of them will be more guilty than others. Anyway, so I kept the vast majority of the class behind at break. And it was also perhaps problematic. This is only occurring to me now, so it's a bit of a tangent, but I just said that I kept them behind and made them read their reading books in silence during break as a punishment. I do not want students to associate reading with a punishment or with sanctions. So that's arguably problematic as well. I'll have to reflect on that one a little bit more. But anyway, it was very much a collective sanction. And like I said, it was the first time I've done it. I've seen other teachers do it before, and I do believe it's, for various reasons, it can be problematic. But anyway, I did it. I thought it was necessary on that particular occasion. I didn't feel particularly good about it afterwards. It wasn't a particularly pleasant experience. I mean, sanctions never are. But anyway, it happened. And then the next lesson, I had my year 10s again the following day. They were really, really good. Really good. So good that it made me think, oh, maybe this is why some teachers seem to favour the collective sanction approach, because it works. And I think that line of thought is potentially a dangerous one. And I have spoken about this slippery slope before in relation to being a shouty teacher. So shouting at students might seem to have short-term positive effects. It might be able to get a student to quickly do what you want them to do in the moment, but it might damage relationships in the long term or have various other negative effects. But because being a bit shouty from time to time does seem to have these immediate positive effects, it's very easy to conclude, oh, this strategy really works. Okay, so I'm going to shout a bit more often, or perhaps you find yourself shouting more often because it has had those immediate positive or seemingly positive effects. And it's a slippery slope to becoming a teacher who shouts regularly. And I think it's the same here. So I had this lesson where I kept students, most of them, behind at the end for a collective sanctioning. And the following lesson was really, really good. And so am I to conclude that it was the collective sanction that made the difference? And if I do make that conclusion, that might make me more likely to collectively sanction my students in the future. And I will admit I have done it once more since then, although that was with a different class. But anyway, you can see how it might be a slippery slope towards becoming the sort of teacher who does collectively punish students. And as we've discussed, as we've touched on already, that approach is problematic for various reasons. It can undermine relationships with students who are obviously less guilty of whatever the crime was than other students. And it seems to be a very heavy-handed approach. It's also difficult if you collectively sanction students. It's very difficult to have any sort of restorative conversation with them, because that needs to happen on an individual basis, and it's hard to do that at the collective level in a way that isn't just a lecture or a telling off. So it is problematic, but it did seem on this occasion to work wonders. But I do think it's important to resist that slippery slope towards becoming the sort of teacher who does collectively sanction, because on this occasion, sure enough, it was the lesson immediately after the collective sanction, but there were several other things that had changed as well. So this next lesson was earlier in the day. It also wasn't a review lesson. As I said at the start, review lessons are often tricky when it comes to behaviour management. This was just back to being kind of an ordinarily formatted lesson where it's far easier to manage behaviour. So there were several things that had changed, and it's too easy to think that one of them in particular made all the difference, when in fact it was probably a cumulative effect of several different changes, and the collective sanction might have made no difference whatsoever. And I think this touches on a broader issue in education. It's very difficult, unless you've got lots and lots and lots of experience, to determine what works. And I also think that this is the benefit of being familiar with the research. It can help you start to focus in on the things that do have an impact, because otherwise, in schools, so many different things change on such a regular basis that it can be very difficult to hone in on what's actually made the difference. And it's all too easy to end up thinking that one of them made all the difference. In fact, it's the fallacy of, it's called post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means, in Latin, it means after this, therefore because of this. So it's the faulty assumption that just because one thing comes after another thing, so me having a good lesson came after me collectively sanctioning all my students, it's the faulty assumption that there's a causal relationship there, when in fact, when so many things change on such a regular basis in schools, it's very difficult to determine causal relationships. However, I do think that the best teachers, those teachers with years and years and years of experience, do end up building up a sense of what works. But that only comes from years, if not decades, of experience. It might be facilitated or sped up by being familiar with research. It can help you zero in on what might be making a difference, but otherwise it just takes thousands and thousands of hours in the classroom to develop that sense for what works. Anyway, right, okay, that was the first thing I wanted to talk about. Before I move on to the second thing, my usual Patreon plea. So this episode took a couple of hours to produce, and I aim to produce a couple of episodes a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so that's £2 to £3 once a month, then please consider signing up on Patreon. And if you do that, you'll be helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution would be greatly appreciated. And if you do sign up, you'll gain exclusive early access to videos of my recording sessions. So if that sounds interesting, again, that's an additional incentive. Today, for example, you'd see me wearing my Christmas jumper, my new Christmas jumper that's got Gandalf and the Balrog on. I'll just stand up so you can see it. A fantastic purchase, maybe my favourite thing that I bought in 2024. So if you'd like to see that, if you'd like to see the videos of my recording sessions, then please consider signing up on Patreon. Thank you very much. Oh, and a link, as always, will be in the show notes. Thanks again. Okay, now, two more things I want to discuss, although they are interrelated, and they still have to do with behaviour management. The first is when you see a trainee teacher struggling to manage behaviour, at what point do you intervene? So it can be tempting to intervene straight away. But if you do intervene straight away, then you rob the trainee of the opportunity to learn how to manage behaviour on their own. Having a particularly negative experience when it comes to trying to manage behaviour could even rattle the trainee. I know I had a couple of experiences like that in my training year, where I started to doubt whether I was up to it. And that's not an experience really that you want trainees to have. But at the same time, if a student is disrupting the lesson, then for the student's sake and for the lesson's sake and for the trainee's sake, the behaviour does need to be challenged and addressed. And if the trainee, for whatever reason, in the moment, can't do that, then surely the more experienced teacher in the room, the mentor, should intervene. But like I said, it's a bit of a dilemma, because the trainee does need to learn to do it themselves. So how do you strike this balance? I'd be interested to hear from trainees and from mentors about the best way to strike this balance. I mean, my initial thoughts on the topic would be that as a trainee is training, they have various different objectives or goals that they want to work on each week, or perhaps over the course of a month or over the course of a term. But within any given lesson, I don't think there should be more than perhaps 2 goals to focus on. I mean, it depends on the type of goal, but it's easy to become overwhelmed as a trainee, and trying to focus on improving too many different things at once can be counterproductive. So I think 1 or 2 things to focus in particular on each lesson is a good number. Now, if during a particular lesson the trainee's goals are both academic goals, so they're to do with perhaps improving explanations or the quality of examples or circulation or whatever it might be, if they are teaching related goals, then they should be the focus. And if a student does begin to act up, then I think that the mentor in the room can intervene quickly, because behaviour management in that particular lesson is not the trainee's focus. However, in a future week, if the mentor and the trainee have agreed that week behaviour management, perhaps with a particular student, is going to be one of the targets or goals, then the mentor shouldn't intervene if that student begins to play up. Because that week, dealing with that particular behaviour management issue is on the to-do list for the trainee, and they need to be afforded that opportunity to grapple with that particular issue. So like I said, there does seem to be a balance to be struck, and it's not always obvious how best that balance is achieved, although I do think it depends on having clear objectives going into each lesson and whether those objectives include behaviour management. Now, this particular issue arises for me because I found myself in this situation recently. I wasn't the mentor in the room, but because the usual mentor had to go to a meeting, so I was just supervising. I stepped in for like 20 minutes and sat at the back of a classroom just to keep an eye on proceedings. And there was a student in there who was playing up awfully. The trainee made several good attempts to manage that student's behaviour, but wasn't having any luck, which is fine. I had wanted to intervene, even just due to my own internal sense of justice. I felt that this student was, almost getting away with it a little bit. If I'd have been the teacher, I'd have clamped down on it straight away. But I mean, that's not particularly helpful for a trainee to hear, because our situations are very different. So I did want to give the trainee the opportunity to try to deal with it. And like I said, made some good attempts, but it wasn't making much of a difference. So I did intervene in the end, and I had the student removed from the lesson. Now, later on, I was talking to the trainee, and the trainee is very reflective, which is fantastic. I do think that one of the characteristics of a successful trainee is the ability to reflect, and to reflect often. And so he was thinking about this in the office, and he turned to me and he asked an excellent question. He said that as a new teacher, his main goal, or one of his main goals, was to make sure that no students are left behind. A very noble goal, with which I wholeheartedly agree. But then he asked me, he said, at what point, James, did you revise that goal, or leave it behind, or give up on it? Which was interesting. So I think that given our earlier experience where I had intervened and gotten this disruptive student removed from the lesson, in his mind, he might have been thinking that the reason he himself hadn't kicked them out sooner was because he didn't want to leave them behind. He didn't want them to miss out on the learning. And when I intervened and had the student removed, perhaps it looked from his perspective that I didn't mind about leaving students behind, because I've just ejected the student. They're no longer in the lesson. They're not doing any learning because they've been kicked out. So it looks on the face of it like I am happy to, almost sacrifice certain students, for the greater good of the class, and to leave some students behind if necessary. And I think that's a reasonable thing to conclude, especially when you're a new teacher. You don't want to kick students out. You come into education with these very optimistic goals, which are so important. I don't use the word optimistic in a pejorative way here. It's a very good thing. Like, I think that education needs a constant influx of trainee teachers and new teachers who are very optimistic about the aims of education and very hopeful about what can be achieved. That kind of keeps the whole profession alive. But what was I saying? Okay, so he thought that I, however, had kind of given up on this goal of not leaving any student behind, because I was more happy to kick students out, and quickly, if they were misbehaving. And so that got me thinking, is that true? Have I given up the goal of leaving no student behind? I don't think I have, but I think that I'm now thinking about that goal in a different way. So when I was first a teacher, I thought about things in a relatively short-sighted way. I mean, on the academic side of things, if you remember, when you're a trainee, you kind of start off by planning individual lessons, but you're encouraged very quickly to start planning whole sequences of lessons. So to go from being short-sighted and considering just a single lesson to thinking in the medium term or even in the long term and start planning whole sequences of lessons. And I think the same shift happens at some point when you start accumulating more experience over your first few years. The same sort of shift happens in your attitude towards behaviour management, and in particular to this goal of not leaving any student behind. So thinking about it in the short term, it would appear that by kicking out a student, I have given up on the goal of not leaving any students behind, because in that particular lesson, I've left them behind. They're gone, they're out. However, thinking about things in the longer term, I would say that for that particular student, yes, I've kicked them out of a lesson, so we have sacrificed a lesson, but I'm hoping that by sanctioning the student in this way and having the follow-up conversations with them, and indeed with their parents if necessary, that's going to result in a longer-term change, a longer-term, more sustainable change. Because if the student isn't met with the appropriate sanctions quickly, then their poor behaviour may continue in future lessons, and so they themselves are losing more learning in the future, and they might also be disrupting the learning of others. But by having that short, sharp, swift sanction, appropriate sanction, you're making a longer term investment. You're kind of saying, okay, we'll sacrifice the present, but for the sake of the future. If we can get this behaviour sorted out quickly, then this is the best way for me as the teacher not to leave you behind in the long term. So in response to that question, I think when we had this conversation in the office, me and this trainee, I don't think I gave him a very satisfactory response, but it has been on my mind since. And so I don't believe that I have given up on the goal of not leaving any students behind. And I don't think any teachers, really, good ones, I don't think any teachers give up on that goal. No teacher wants to leave a student behind. However, when you've been teaching for a little bit longer, you develop a slightly more long-term view of things. So it's an excellent question. Thank you so much. If you're listening, I know this trainee does sometimes listen to the podcast, so if you're listening, thank you for that question. It was a very, very good one. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had a lovely Christmas break and a happy New Year, and I look forward to checking in with you once every couple of weeks, as I did for most of last year, but obviously had to have that little hiatus towards the end of last year. But I'm hoping to get back to the usual routine nice and quick. And I hope that the start back to school in January isn't too tricky, isn't too challenging. It can be hard, but I hope it goes as smoothly as can be. And I'll check back in with you in a few weeks' time. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.